Awesome. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining this panel today on the challenges facing the utilities workforce. To tell you just a little bit more about myself before I jump into the talk, my name is Ryan Edwards. I have a PhD in history and human geography. I'm certified in GIS. And for the last 10 years, I've studied the relationship between the built environment and the natural world. What I can tell you is that we're standing at the precipice of a truly fundamental shift with regard to technology and infrastructure through the utilities industry. This shift is something that's on par with two of the most significant changes that we've experienced in our country's history, and it's something that I'd like to dive into right now. So thank you for joining me today. Let's start with the elephant in the room. The utilities grid was built in and for the 20th century. In fact, over 60% of it was completed in the prior to the 1980s. Now, to be clear, the utilities grid is one of our country's greatest technological achievements. By some standards, it could be considered the single largest operating machine in the world. For those of you that listened to the panel earlier this morning, Russ described a nuclear power plant that's been in continuous operation for 100 years. For us here at a software company, we marvel at the hardware that makes up this infrastructure. Astronaut Neil Armstrong even said that the electric grid was a more significant feat than him being the first human to set foot on the moon. But even the greatest of inventions at some point reached their twilight years. By 2017, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave the grid a D+ rating. Many of you know this from firsthand experience as you operate and maintain assets in the field that have long exceeded their optimal life cycles. So you might ask yourself, can we just swap out the parts? Well, first of all, replacing the existing grid would cost roughly $5 trillion and would honestly be a giant step backwards. I mean, let's be honest, you can also replace your VHS from 1981, but I'm guessing most of you are subscribed to a video streaming service these days. So how can we address this problem intelligently to ensure that the American utility infrastructure continues to be a model for the rest of the world to emulate? First, we must recognize just how monumental the moment is that's unfolding before us. As you can see on this timeline, each epoch has been defined by a technological and infrastructural transformation. They each required a commitment from the country as a whole, from both state and federal governments, as well as social and cultural buy-in. In the 19th century, railroads and telegraph lines erased physical barriers for commerce and communication. And in the 20th century, automobiles and the electric grid redefined the American household and individual mobility, not to mention indoor plumbing. With each case, social expectations changed and a new and highly trained workforce was needed to complete these projects. It also forced companies to change, or they were left behind. The mobile company that we know today as Sprint, for example, is actually an acronym for the Southern Pacific Railroad Internal Networking Telephony. Back in the 1800s, its founders could not have imagined satellites orbiting the Earth to enable telecommunications that we carry around in our pockets. Henry Ford replaced the horse and buggy and wanted each of his assembly line workers to afford one of the cars that they helped manufacture. We now have self-driving cars. They're equipped with Bluetooth audio, backup cameras, and a number of other features that were unimaginable just a decade or two ago. And the utilities grid is no different. Roughly 100 years after the first distribution lines went live, Secretary of Energy Bill Richardson characterized the grid as a third world system, and he repeated this assertion just a few years ago. But luckily, things are changing, and we've already heard about some of those changes this morning. In our moment, the Internet of Things and distributed energy resources are now allowing people to work from home, to sync dozens of smart devices, to offset their own reliance on traditional power generation, and to establish two-way communication with service providers. And when they do so, they're often greeted by a chatbot on the other end. This is indeed a brave new world, and the traditional utility model might be unrecognizable to us in the not too distant future. The question is, who will you hire to build the grid of the 21st century? And make no mistake, it will be the next generation of workers that completes, operates, and maintains the grid of the future as they take the torch from the skilled and talented workforce that we currently have. But hiring this new generation comes with its own set of challenges. More than 1 in 4 utility workers will retire this decade, and half of the entire industry will be retirement eligible. Nearly 3 out of 4 providers, therefore, are already struggling to make meaningful and qualified hires. The industry is therefore plagued by what we call brain drain, or the process by which the experienced outgoing workforce has developed decades worth of specialty skills and knowledge that is very difficult to transfer to incoming workers. So what happens when more workers are going out than are coming in? Outsourcing. Now, outsourcing is not necessarily a bad thing, but currently in some regions of the country, upwards of 75% of operations are supplemented or completed by third-party contractors. This is expensive, it's unpredictable, it creates information silos and miscommunication, and it is simply not a sustainable model moving forward. The industry therefore faces 2 major challenges from a workforce perspective. How do you capture legacy knowledge before the outgoing workforce retires? And how do you attract and train the next generation of field teams and other workers? Frankly, this is not a singular problem, and there is no short-term fix. Rather, we must think of the largest retirement wave in US history as an opportunity to reimagine the utility workforce as a whole. Providers that want to remain competitive must seamlessly integrate the legacy and future systems through digital tools and solutions. These solutions have to manage data and workflows across dispersed networks that unite the field and the office in new ways. It is admittedly no simple task. In fact, it would be fair to call it a seismic shift for the industry as a whole. You are not replacing one generation with the next. You are tasked with equipping an entirely new workforce with tools that simply did not exist for the previous generation. So as you reimagine your hiring approach, more important than a particular college degree or education level is the acknowledgement that all future hires will be digital natives, whether they are inspecting crossbores, installing solar panels, or pruning trees in a rights of way. So what are the first steps to tackling this monumental challenge? Reimagining the workforce requires understanding the next wave of labor, but also it requires understanding that wave of labor and their consumer habits. So let's start with a bad word, millennials. Some of you might roll your eyes when you hear this word, and believe me, I get it. I was born in 1984, right on the cusp of the millennial category, and more than once I've taken pride in my experience growing up in an analog household. But every time I check my email on my smartphone, watch a movie based on a streaming algorithm, or find my way home using Google Maps rather than my Thomas guide, I must admit that I have taken the digital plunge. Anyone born after 1990, however, cannot make this distinction. They are characterized instead as digital natives, or someone who grew up with digital technology and the internet from a very young age. It is literally second nature to them. If you have ever struggled with your laptop or smartphone and went to your child, perhaps a niece or nephew, or even the newest intern, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. They might be relying on technology, but they are incredibly proficient with it. They are comfortable, they're competent, and they expect to use digital solutions in the workplace, no matter what their profession is. So in order to understand how this new workforce can be incorporated into the utilities industry, let's pause and think about them first as consumers. Digital natives demand control and customization in every aspect of their lives. From utility providers, they have specific expectations. They want two-way communication. They want energy choice and supplements to traditional delivery models, as well as rate customization based on their use habits and automation. So whether they're working from home, storing their school assignments in the cloud, or using voice command to run their appliances, every aspect of their life is connected to the internet and therefore an energy source. So let's consider some specific examples. Let's think about power outages for a moment. Power outages have plagued all of our lives at some point, and many of you attending this session today are literally heroes for keeping the grid running in those moments. But the stakes are higher now more than ever, and it's not simply because of COVID and our current work from home moment. Researchers at Accenture found that demand for distributed energy resources are roughly 87% of next-gen consumers. That's basically 9 out of 10 people. Why? They want to ensure that if a central transmission source goes down, their lives will continue uninterrupted. And not only do they have the demand for these kinds of technologies and new grid elements, but they also increasingly have the buying power. Millennials and the next generation, by 2022, nearly half of the world's buying power will come from millennials and Gen X. In other words, utilities are not just hiring a new labor force. You are hiring a consumer base that is eager to build a new grid, one in which they will be the ideal end users. So let's think about this new generation in the context of the outgoing generation and their consumer-driven transition. As you can see in the graph here, millennials now make up the largest group in the American workforce. They are also the most educated generation in history, and ironically, this is a problem. Researchers at Deloitte report that currently 1 in 4 employees with a college degree is overqualified for their position. As a result, younger people are continually on the job market looking for better opportunities and have been described as the quote-unquote job hopping generation. This will have an outsized impact on the utilities sector in particular, because as most of you know, the majority of field members and crews in the industry have traditionally been trained in vocational and trade schools or at local community colleges. And it's been a really good system. Workers have been loyal and have moved up as they gain experience and specialized skills, and providers have been able to service communities in rural and urban areas alike with this dedicated workforce. But as the younger generation attains higher education levels, they have sought alternative career paths. Moreover, the industry is requiring a new and different set of skills. What's the result? At present, 63% of utilities say that their current interviewees lack sufficient qualifications or education for the job that they're applying for. The good news is that while more and more workers have a bachelor's degree, younger generations value educational and work milestones throughout their careers. In fact, while a college degree continues to be the single greatest predictor of future income, a whole host of alternatives are proving valuable for young workers and their families. For example, 87% of millennials say that job growth through certification and skills-based training is highly important to them. In other words, a college degree is only one credential for the 21st century worker, and it does not have to define the utility workforce. Younger generations hope to continue their education and build a portfolio of certifications throughout their career. This is referred to as micro-learning, and it's creating what many have called a new collar workforce, one that blurs the line between traditional blue and white collar jobs. The new collar worker develops technology and digital skills through a variety of educational paths that, as again we heard this morning, are often sponsored by their employers. This is a solid opportunity for utility companies to work within their existing training structures to attract young talent. After all, the industry has always been defined by skill-based milestones within trades and craftsmanship, within environmental compliance and risk management. So re-examine your onboarding processes and think about ways to break the training cycle down into discrete skills that can be labeled and certified. Startups, strategic partnerships with local institutions. Younger generations want proof of their achievements, both for satisfaction in their current job and, let's be honest, potential accolades that they might be using to acquire their next job. The truth is that this is a new reality for all job sectors, because at the end of the day, millennials and the generations that will come after them were simply raised in a different epoch. They only know of a world in which everything is available at their fingertips, and measurable gratification, trust me, for better or worse, is a real motivator. Savvy utilities will take this into account when building their new hiring strategies. All right, let's look at some concrete examples. Let's start with renewable energy and what has been dubbed the green economy. 20 years ago, the prospects of renewable energy were unknown. Prices were high and the technology was simply unproven. But those days are long gone. We have electric cars, advanced metering infrastructures, microgrids, and a whole host of other new technologies that will only further this shift. And again, these are changes that are driven by young consumer habits in some really surprising ways. Yale's climate change communication program found that millennials are willing to pay twice as much as their parents for green energy. Crazier still, 40% of millennials say that they're willing to take a pay cut to work for an environmentally responsible company. And once they have that job, 70% say that they are more likely to stay with the company if it has an outlined sustainability agenda. So what does all this mean? Consumers want to affect change through their work, which is your work. And all of you know that this transition is already underway. You have done an incredible job over the previous decade or two. The Brattle Group predicts that wind and solar will now represent 70% of all new generation in 2021. And yet, nearly half of the current workforce lacks the experience and technical skills to carry out tasks for the new renewable energy grid. So again, this is precisely the type of challenge that the young millennial workforce endeavors to undertake. But in order to attract this talent, it begins with messaging. Because in truth, if you ask the average person to explain the difference between a distribution or transmission, or between a main line and a lateral, they likely wouldn't know the answer. And they might assume that smart grid jobs are only found at startups or with technology companies. There's simply a lot of confusion out there. However, millennials know what they want, even if they don't know what that is. For example, they respond negatively to the term oil and gas, but they respond positively to the word energy. So when they think about the utilities world, they're gravitated towards terms like clean, grid, and renewable. I've seen on LinkedIn, many of your organizations are already doing this kind of work, but the education campaign must continue to attract the next generation of talented workforce. So let's talk about potential here, because you might be sitting there wondering, how are we going to make this happen? Hiring is expensive and it's time consuming, but consider the massive number in front of you. $2 trillion. This is what the current administration has set to reach a net zero emissions economy by 2050. But make no mistake, it's not just the federal government. By 2025, more than 35 states will have renewable portfolio standards. These are insane numbers, but the truth is they're not unprecedented if we look at them historically. After all, roads were made possible by land grants, automobiles required state and federal highways. This is how paradigm shifts happen. So, regardless of whether this plan can be fully or only partially implemented by the current administration, and let's be honest, things change with every administration, the changing direction of the utilities industry is nevertheless clear. So take advantage of federal programs when they exist, as well as local incentives, whether that's a jobs training program or expanding your capital budgets to incorporate new technologies and update assets in the field. All right, let's round out this talk then by talking about how field devices in particular can address each of the issues that I've outlined thus far. And we can start here again with the obvious. Digital natives control their lives with smart devices, and they expect to use those same tools in the workplace, and in your case, in the field. In fact, older generations are getting there too. At present, 69% of households contain at least one smart device, and this goes beyond phones. But what's become so common in our homes has yet to catch up with the utility workplace. In fact, in 2018, a study from J.D. Power concluded that utility providers fared poorly when it came to delivering positive digital experiences, whether that was across their websites, mobile apps, social media, or chat functions. Overall, the industry scored a 57% on digital proficiency. So how can you use digital tools to improve your onboarding process and capture legacy knowledge? Well, let's revisit this idea of what's happening in the field. In 2019, less than 10% of field service management deployment utilized digital knowledge sharing tools. By 2025, this number should thankfully reach 50%, but that's still behind consumer habits. Let me put that in a different light. On my phone, I can access every single draft of my 300-page dissertation. I can read every edit and every other detail of the document. If I want some useless information about a movie star's birthday, how many people live in Argentina, or any other random fact, I type a query into a search engine and click a button. Or I can simply ask Siri. But if your field crews want access to updated property boundaries, if they need to know what material a subterranean asset is made of, or a host of other critical information, they often don't have access to it. And sometimes this occurs when they need it most. So putting digital tools into the hands of your field crews is crucial, and it needs to be as easy as possible for everyone to buy in. In terms of onboarding, technology platforms have come a long way in this regard. Today, many employees can be trained in just 48 hours with mobile platforms. These platforms can then use outcome-based metrics to track and manage field team productivity and reduce wasted man hours by providing up-to-date real-time information for dispatched crews. For capturing legacy knowledge, these new field technologies tap into previously siloed information to close the skills gap and ultimately help to attract new desirable candidates. Just think of all the information that a senior employee has in their head as they walk a job site or complete an inspection task. Only a small fraction of that information will make it into a document or an email, into a stored flash drive or a hard drive. And let's be honest, even when it does, how many eyes will get onto that information? If senior employees are shadowed by trainees with smart devices spread out across your job sites, literally decades of experience can be captured for analysis within just a few weeks. These cloud platforms can catalog hundreds and hundreds of data points and document critical information every single time field teams are dispatched. Smart devices can take photos of problems. They can capture video of repair jobs. They can list specs and building components. They can input precise measurements rather than back of envelope guesses, and a host of other tasks that your field teams can utilize. The things that are most important to you that can then be uploaded immediately to your company's server or cloud service. This information would then be available to anyone who needs it, wherever they are, whenever. And while the future is unknown, capturing this information now prepares you for unexpected changes. Optimizing data collection now and transfer through smart devices will ensure analytics and capitalization in the future, as well as storing everything that you need for reporting and compliance that will forever be a changing landscape and moving target. So there are a number of takeaways for adopting field technologies, many of which you'll hear in subsequent panels today and tomorrow, but let me highlight just a few. First, they can reduce the skills and education gap that coincides with the largest retirement wave in history. You can capture legacy knowledge before it goes out the door forever. You can improve data capture and sharing with the office and your customers. And you can adapt to regulatory and environmental standards that we cannot even predict today. But if I can leave you with just one thought, or perhaps an incentive to stick around for subsequent panels, it's this. We are one generation away from a workforce that is 100% digital natives. Your solution cannot simply be to replace legacy knowledge. You must build the utility workforce of the future, one that is nimble and agile and will continue the tradition of trade skills while leveraging a robust network of new digital tools for the future. Thank you very much, everybody. I don't think we have much time for questions, but I assure you, if you contact me, I'd be happy to answer anything that you have.